I'm very pleased to be able to welcome and introduce Brooke van Velden to us this morning. You all know that she's a major player in ACT. She's the deputy leader. She's also a whip. She's spokesperson for health and housing, foreign affairs and trade. So she's a busy girl. She's got an interesting background. She was a noted student at St Cuthbert's, and then she studied at Auckland University. She qualified in economics and international trade. She won scholarships to study economics in Europe, and she received awards sponsored by Treasury for technical papers on economics. She's had some work experience in the real world. Immediately prior to becoming an MP, however, she spent 2 years working in Parliament to help draft and then gather support for the End of Life Choice Bill. Recently, as ACT's health spokesperson, she's been pushing the government on their poor level of commitment to rural health and has been able to make them recognise this, and they'll now increase funding to that area. So a better level of support to rural communities is a very good thing, Brooke. Okay? We're all keen to hear what she has to say, so please welcome Brooke.
Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you, Mirko, and everybody for being here today. I think it's quite remarkable, really, that you've not every week waking up to hear from new speakers, but in particular have turned up today to hear from a politician. I mean, there are many better things that you could be doing with your life than hearing from people who are in politics. But I really do thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's wonderful to be here. So a little bit about my background has already been shared, but I thought today I would talk a little bit about ACT's alternative budget, but also a few other ideas that have been on my mind, because I do hold, like Roger said, quite a few ranges of portfolios, housing, health, foreign affairs and trade, and there's something huge going in all of them. And if you're a bit like me, you kind of see the headlines coming out every week, and they don't make you feel very hopeful. And I hope to give a little bit of hope for people here who don't like the government, that in fact it looks like change is coming. And in one of the recent polls, I think it was Roy Morgan that came out just this week, it showed that ACT and National together have around 50% of the vote. Now this is a trajectory that I think is going to be increasing towards the election. But for me, when it comes to politics, I don't really want to wake up in the morning and think, wow, it's great that the polls are shifting and we're going to have a change of government. Because I don't think that really changes much unless you have a change of direction and you have a change of policy. Because you can just change the letterhead and you can change who's in charge of the systems of government, but unless you're actually seeing real change, then what's the difference? And so that's what I'm really trying to promote. Not even at the election, but every day I wake up, that we actually need better public policy in New Zealand, because I think we're seeing ourselves in a slow, gradual decline of productivity. I think we're in an area where a lot of young people are waking up and saying, what has New Zealand actually got to offer me? And they're heading overseas. And we know that Treasury actually predicted that 50,000 people this year alone will head overseas. And so I really want to see a change of direction. And so when I looked at the alternative budget, we see every year when the budget is released, everybody in the media and the government says, let's all talk about who are the biggest winners. Let's talk about the biggest handouts that we can give, and we'll try and buy people's votes. And I think we need a better way of system of government. I talked to a woman who told me that she's moving her entire family off to Canada, all of her 4 kids, because she's sick of being fodder for a handout culture. She doesn't get anything from the budget. She's working hard, getting up every morning, trying to make sure that her kids have something better than she had, but she just feels like everything's being taken from her. And with the cost of living rising, and she's not getting anything back, there's nothing in it for her. She sees education standards slipping and wonders why on earth she has to pay for extra tuition so that her kids can actually get ahead. And when I was at a public meeting recently, I try and host a public meeting every month, I talked to this woman who said, you know, her daughter came home from school one day crying because she said that she didn't learn anything. And it's because they had these massive classrooms, 70 kids in a class with 2 teachers, no walls, no real system of how people are supposed to learn every day. And her kid came home crying, saying that she didn't learn anything. So this poor mother's gone out to get extra tuition after hours to make sure that her kid actually has a future. And I think we just have to do everything better. You know, we have to address productivity standards. You know, Estonia has double the amount of foreign direct investment coming into their country per capita than we do. You know, we proclaim to be a first world country, and yet there are ex-Soviet states that are overtaking us in terms of productivity per hour worked. And that leads to higher wage growth, that leads to a more productive economy. And that's why a lot of younger people are thinking, well, what has New Zealand got to offer us? And I think as a government, we've just seen the government borrow and spend over COVID, and they've now become addicted to this idea that they can just keep borrowing and spending, and they've now gone to about $160 billion. And yet people are still wondering, where is the money going? What use is it for me? And I think we need to get smarter at stopping this idea that every year we wake up and say, what is the government going to give me? And start asking for those longer term trends of what sort of country do we actually want to be? Do we want to be a country where it's a nice place to visit, or a nice little Pacific island? Or do we want to be more like Singapore, where people actually have a get up and go spirit, and we can have aspiration and success and strive for more? And that's the kind of society that I want to live in. Because otherwise, if you think of our long-term problems, like even funding superannuation, it's going to be extremely difficult and unsustainable to pay for that if all of the young, productive people leave and go offshore. So we have some real societal problems that we have to address as a country. I think we need to get away from a lot of wasteful spending. You know, the ACT Party has found around $6 billion in our alternative budget that we can cut. You know, $500 million to pay for overseas film companies' subsidies is not good use of taxpayer money. Borrowing money to then put it in the super fund is not good use of money, because you're borrowing to invest. That's not good use of money. Things like the Jobs for Nature scheme, which has been a complete failure, where the government has essentially said we need to pay people to do conservation projects in New Zealand. And then they've ended up finding that there are no people that want to fill these jobs, and so the jobs are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of these things should be scrapped. You know, since the government came into office, the number of bureaucrats in Wellington has grown by 14,000 people. I mean, if anybody's had any interaction with any of these people recently, you'd know that there's not actually a lot that they're doing, and they're not giving you any service for the jobs that they're producing. So the ACT Party says we would zero base and go back to the 2017 levels, because we're not actually getting value for money for people working in bureaucracy in Wellington. It's not part of the productive economy. There's a lot of things that we can cut, and I think that's really important. Because if you're a young person, you're staring down debt levels that we haven't seen for decades. And that money has to get paid back by somebody. And that's going to get paid back by our younger generation, who are once again staring down this debt and thinking, you could get paid more overseas, or you could stay here and get sucked into the tall poppy syndrome that tells people if they want to succeed, they're a bad person. So I think we need to have a culture shift that acknowledges that we want to be an aspirational society where people can get ahead. And that's why the ACT Party not only opposed the government's budget, but we put forward our alternative budget and said, look, we actually do need to do better at spending in some other areas, but there's an awful lot of money that just gets sloshed around the system and doesn't go anywhere productive. So the areas that I'd like to see more money being spent on are things like defence. And if you've read the news, like I know some of our friends here when I was talking before have, one area that I'm really quite passionate on in my foreign affairs portfolio is China moving into the Pacific. And I think that has a real threat to us here in New Zealand, because I like the idea that everyone in New Zealand is equal. We all have equal rights, we all have one vote, and we all have the ability to freely speak our minds. And we're seeing that that liberal democratic idea is under threat around the world. You only have to look at Ukraine to see that Russia, its authoritarian regime neighbor, invaded because they were getting closer to democratic ideas and they wanted to join with the rest of Western Europe. And that was enough of a threat for Russia to want to invade them. And we're seeing that with the threats against Taiwan and Hong Kong that happen with China. You know, there are the ability to have free thought, to have free and open elections, but unfortunately that's not what the Chinese Communist Party believes in. And I think we really need to worry that over the last 30 years, we've been living in a benign strategic environment where we have had relative peace and security in the Pacific, and we haven't had to think about what would happen if we saw warships in our waters. I think that is going to change. We've seen just before the Australian election that we had a warship just off the coast of Australia. We've also had a security pact that was signed between the Solomon Islands and China. And in the last few weeks, we've seen the foreign minister go and do a tour of 10 Pacific islands in the hopes that they would sign a security agreement. Not only did it uncover things like cybersecurity and the fisheries, it also had things like new fingerprinting. There was a whole range of different things all tied up into this agreement, and I'm glad that they rejected it, but I don't think China is done. And I think the West and Western liberal democratic values will be under threat over the next few years. So what I've said as ACT Party's foreign affairs spokesperson is that we need to get serious on defence. We actually need to start playing our part because it's unfair that we would expect our friends to come to our assistance if we don't do anything or even show any tiny bit of effort. So we want to commit to spending 2% of our GDP on defence. That would keep us in line with what NATO expects and would keep us in line with what Australia has. And I think that's really important so that we can have an interoperable defence force in the Pacific. And I think one of the first things that we need to do is actually get a new ship for the waters for policing that was canned in the last term. So that's what I think is really important for not only just the security of our neighbours, but for our long-term strategic security too. And I think, you know, you can get sucked into talking about whether you think a $350 handout is an important idea, or you can think about what is going to be the future of New Zealand for the next 30 years. And that's where I put my thinking cap on. For health, one thing I was really disappointed in with the health portfolio was seeing that breast cancer screening didn't get enough funding in the budget. You know, I have been a big proponent of the Breast Cancer Foundation over the last few years, and with the budget, they were asking for $15 million to increase their screening capability to catch up on the 50,000 women that didn't have mammograms during COVID lockdowns. You know, when everything locked down, and especially for Auckland, breast cancer screening was not seen as an essential service. So I met this wonderful woman called Heidi. She's absolutely fantastic. She's a GP. And when the lockdowns happened, she was actually going around and taking her temperature for herself, because she's a bit of a scientist, and she noticed that her temperature started changing. And she actually diagnosed herself with breast cancer. And she wasn't able to get a mammogram, but she pushed and pushed and pushed, and she finally got one and was told, if you had waited, you would probably be dead. And there are 130 women out there that the Breast Cancer Foundation predict, based on the modelling that they have, and they collect samples from every woman who's had breast cancer. They have more data on this than the government does. They have 130 women walking around who don't know they have breast cancer because COVID was put at the heart of everything and not people's health. And so the Breast Cancer Foundation just had a simple idea, and they said, well, we know that we've got enough money to do all the women for this year, but why don't you give us a little bit more to catch up with the women that we couldn't get last time? And the government said no. And in the meantime, they've just spent $500 million on trying to reform the healthcare sector, and nobody that I talk to in the healthcare sector can actually point to how this will change anybody's life. You know, I've talked to mental health practitioners and said, will this actually change anything that you do? And they said, no, we don't even know how it works. We don't even know when the 1st of July comes along how we're getting funded. I mean, we're still a few days away, and they still don't know what's happening to their contracts. You know, you talk to rural health practitioners and they say, you know, nobody's told us how this will actually make access in a rural area any better. And I'm very proud that I managed to convince the government that we needed a rural health strategy so that when this reform takes place, we're not completely forgetting about access issues for rural health. There are just so many problems where people don't get good access to care, but the government has just been obsessed with reform for the sake of it, and rather than actually looking at outcomes and opportunities. And I think we do need to do better at looking at how do we get more nurses and doctors into the country, rather than how do we change the administration of a department with no clear goal in mind. And just for a little bit of background, because I was just sitting on the Paiora Legislation Committee up until last week when Paiora, which is the health reform, happened. Essentially what's happening is we've taken away all of the 20 DHBs, so they won't exist on the 1st of July, but in their place there'll be the Māori Health Authority and Health New Zealand working together, but underneath that there'll be up to 80 localities, which will be put in place by the iwi Māori partnership boards. Now when you talk to the minister, he doesn't know yet who the iwi Māori partnership boards will be because they're self-selecting, and he doesn't know how many localities there will be because the iwi Māori partnership boards are the ones who make up the number. So he says we now have about 8, but there could be up to 80. So we're reforming the whole sector to get rid of 20 DHBs because apparently that was the postcode lottery, and we've now put in place maybe up to 80, but we don't know, and we won't know for another 2 years. It's bureaucratic madness costing us hundreds of millions of dollars, and there is no clear outcomes that will be improved from this legislation. So the ACT Party has opposed that and said we actually need to look at real practical things like how do we get more doctors and nurses to want to train and to get them into the country, and how do we make ourselves a productive country that where immigrants might be looking to go somewhere offshore, they're looking to come to New Zealand and not Australia and Canada, because that is what's going to happen unless we get productivity to where we want to see it around the world. When I look at housing, that's another one of my portfolios. I mean, there's just so much you could talk about there. But one area that I have been standing solely against in Parliament, was the recent, what they call MDRS changes. And so this is called the Mixed Density Residential Standard. Has anybody heard of that? No? Well, it's coming to your neighbourhood very soon. And I'm surprised, you know, it's something that Labour and National both stood at a podium last year, just before Christmas, and said, you know what guys, we have finally found a solution to the housing crisis. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to say anywhere in a big city, you can have three-story homes on any section. And that's going to solve the housing crisis. Now, we heard this announcement and thought, well, that sounds a bit that sounds a bit odd, that sounds a bit crazy. Let's go and actually talk to people who build homes. And so we did. We went out and talked to architects, council planners, developers, a whole range of people. And they all said, this is a crazy idea and it's not going to work. And it's not going to solve the housing crisis. Because if you look at the Auckland Unitary Plan, for example, the Auckland Unitary Plan allows for 400,000 homes in Auckland. Now this is for a 30-year plan. They have 400,000 homes. They have a million homes, but they say that's a theoretical number, and it's more likely to be 400,000 that could be built. That has allowed the Auckland Council to plan, and they've said, yep, there should be higher intensity in these areas and not these areas, because we can provide for the infrastructure that's needed to connect those homes to a community. We can provide for the roading networks, the water, the sewages. We can know that if we're expecting 100 houses on a particular street, we need to upgrade the pipes in that area. What this new plan does is just cause chaos. And so I was proud as the ACT Party's housing spokesperson to actually stand and say we need to be smarter thinking about policy. You know, we can't just say overnight and proclaim that we're going to solve the housing crisis by changing the zoning laws. We actually need to have a little bit of realism here, and that the real problem behind why people can't build homes is because of infrastructure. We have a massive infrastructure deficit in Auckland, and the Auckland Council has actually come out against these proposals as well and said the real issue why they take so long to consent anything is because they don't have the infrastructure and the funding for infrastructure that's needed to connect homes. We already have sewage leaking into the streets and the waterways because our wastewater system has been underfunded. We can actually make sure that there are roads and networks going to homes where they can plan for them through ACT Party policy, rather than building homes wherever, theoretically, where it was never expected to go. And I think this is going to cause a lot of chaos and division, especially as people start seeing these homes pop up in areas they never expected, and especially where the council never expected them to pop up either. And so the ACT Party said, we actually need a long-lasting solution to this problem. The problem is infrastructure, and it's the deficit. We've said that every time a new home gets built within Auckland or any other city, 50% of the GST on that home should go to the council that issued that consent. And that would give around $1 billion a year to local councils to fund the infrastructure they need for the home developments in their areas. And the best part about that solution is that the more homes that get consented in a particular area, the more money the council gets. So there's an incentive structure. Because if I don't know about you, but does anyone here drive a car? Yeah, quite a few. And who's recently had a parking ticket? No, oh, you're all very good citizens. But the councils are very efficient when it comes to issuing parking tickets. And that's because they know that they get revenue from you. And if we created a housing system that was similar to councils issuing parking tickets, you would imagine that they'll be trying to chase you down the street, trying to get you to build a new home. And that's the kind of solution that we need. Rather than making it the council's problem, we make it a good thing for them to see houses being built, because they know that there'll be a new home, but they also won't be stomaching all the cost for that home. It won't be seen as a burden. Instead, they'll actually get revenue for it. I think that's really important and enduring. So those are some areas that I've been looking into, but I'm also very happy for questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, Jill.
What's ACT's position on co-governance?
Oh, we're opposed to co-governance. But I think the issue here is that people haven't been able to talk about it. Now, one thing that really drew me to the ACT Party to begin with, this is going back about eight years ago, I think, I joined the ACT Party because ACT was open to new ideas, but they were also open to free expression. And I think one thing that we're losing in society is the ability to actually have open debate. And I don't really enjoy that any time somebody goes up and says, I don't like the idea that we're changing democracy in New Zealand, the media or other people say, oh, you can't say that, that sounds racist. And I think that's wrong. And we actually need to have a debate. If we're changing the constitution of New Zealand, we need to be having an open debate. And what the government has been doing, particularly with the Three Waters reform and with the healthcare sector, is that they've said instead of having policies based on need, we're going to have them based on race, or we're going to separate people into governing institutions based on their race rather than based on their abilities. And I think that is wrong. And we actually need to have a conversation about that. And so actors said, you know, if we are going to go down the idea of having treaty principles written into every part of our constitution, or if we're going to have co-governance arrangements, we need to have an open debate and we need to have a referendum on it. Because one area that I don't want to see is people feeling like they can't talk about issues in society. But also, if we're going away from the idea that everybody has an equal right and an equal say and we have equal votes under the law, we actually need the ability to talk about it and the ability to vote on it.
I work in health, and we received a document 2 weeks ago, and we get a lot of documents about the current COVID pandemic situation. We received a document, the 7 principles, and the 7 principles, and this was safe visiting and aged care services, and the 7 principles essentially issued new rules for Māori in terms of our inability to restrict access in a pandemic situation. And the issues of equality aren't, I think that you're absolutely correct. I think we need to talk about partnership and we need to be serious in our commitment around the treaty. But it's occurring by stealth. So essentially, I would, as a CEO, any ability to restrict the access of a certain group of the community in the event of a full-blown outbreak of COVID in our facility. If those folk were Māori, identified as Māori, and wanted to, or Pacifica, and wanted to visit, I have no ability to stop them. And it's a private. This is a not-for-profit. We're not a DHB service. So it's very interesting, and it's occurring in so many areas. It's occurring in schools.
That's really interesting. So where did the letter come from?
Ministry of Health.
Ministry of Health. Well, that is quite incredible.
Yeah,
I mean,
and so I just think that we need to be quite aware of what's occurring, and it sends a really mixed message, because on the one hand, I'm accountable for mitigate. I'm accountable for reducing risk, and yet I'm unable, if I follow the letter of this, to exercise what I know is appropriate practice to produce a safe environment. I mean, we're meeting with David on Monday to discuss it.
oh, that's good.
So,
Yeah.
but I just think it's something that's occurring. We're getting so much ambiguity, and I think we're all nervous about ambiguity, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think what you've raised is a really salient point. I mean, I think it's really dangerous for us to be going down these paths of creating policy based on people's races rather than basing on people's needs. Because firstly, I think it's not going to work. It's only going to create a more divided society, especially as it comes with no real ability to talk about it openly. People will feel like it's being forced on them. And I don't think that's good for any society, and especially not for people who are of different ethnicities, who want no part of this. You know, I've got multiple colleagues in my own party who say, you know, all the rhetoric that the Māori Party spout off and the Labour Party MPs from the Māori caucus spout off doesn't actually sit right with me, because I just want to be an equal part of the society like everybody else. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are a multi-ethnic society. We do need to acknowledge people's differences, and especially when it comes to people's different cultural practices. But it can't be basing policy on race. It needs to be based on need. I'm actually really concerned to hear that. I don't think that that's good, and it also shows that, you know, some of these COVID restrictions and policy that's been put in place by the government has got nothing to do with health anymore. It's got nothing to do with health, and in my personal opinion, most of it should just go. You know, I was talking to, some chiropractors the other day, and would you believe, most of them still have mandates. And I said, well, this is ridiculous. You know, we're now in a society with Omicron, and, you know, you don't even know through contact tracing where you have managed to pick up a virus from. You know, it's just so impossible. It's everywhere around us. And yet, at the same time, we're still saying to entire industry groups, you can't work unless you're vaccinated. And I think that's, once again, a divisive policy. We have to have the ability to have, if we're still going to have mandates, the ability for people to say, yep, it's either mandate or test. And you could go to work if you test every day. And I think that's a better solution for our long-term problems. But I think a lot of the COVID restrictions do need to go, and we need to move on. And one of the areas in particular was I was doing some of David's street corner meetings the other week. He gets very involved in the community and took me out for one of the Sundays. And I met a couple who run a childcare facility. And the woman started crying and said it's so hard to actually do business under the COVID settings because she has around 70 staff over multiple facilities, and at any given time she only has 20 of them able to turn up to work because of the household contact restrictions. You know, these people are not even COVID positive, but some of their family members might be COVID positive, and it means that they're taken away from the workforce. So this poor business has to call up people every day to say, sorry, you can't take your kids into childcare facility today. And lo and behold, that means that a whole range of people now can't go to work for the whole day and for the whole week. And none of these employees had COVID. And I think that's got to change too.
The on Three Waters, the bill's going through the House at the moment.
Yes, the Three Waters bill is going through the House at the moment.
Do you know when the payout date is in terms of the, I guess it's the bribe that government's handing out to all the various councils throughout New Zealand, including Auckland, 150 million, which is going to be worked into their budget to try and balance the budget, which is 250 million short. Is that a fact? It was just mentioned on the Herald this week.
Well, there has been. So, yeah, you're right. Three Waters, the reform has gone through Parliament. It's gone through its first reading just yesterday, and it's going through a little bit of a shortened select committee. And my understanding is that they want to pass it before Christmas. And I think there's a lot of reform that the government is trying to rush through before Christmas, before they get into the election year, in the hopes that people will forget that they passed it in the first place, kind of cynically. But also, I think, because I think they know that they might not get back in. So they're going to try and overhaul all of the systems while they can and try and get them solidified. But you are right insofar as the government has also tried to bribe the councils by giving money, and it's not through Three Waters, it's through other payments to say, I think it was around $2 billion up and down New Zealand. That figure might be wrong though, to say, here's a slush fund and you can spend this money on whatever you want. Now most of the councils have rejected this and said, thanks, but no thanks, we still don't want Three Waters, because people are going to this eyes wide open.
So it's not deliberately ignoring what he's been saying for months and months. We're not going to be part of Three Waters, but if you give us 150 million, we'll be quite able to put that into our roads budget.
You know, I think part of the issue there is, you know, they aren't getting paid for Three Waters, but the government is giving them money that they can spend in untargeted ways. So if you're a council and you're feeling like you're cash strapped and you've got only a range of choices about where you get your money, and you're saying, well, I either raise my rates, which nobody likes, or the government's just going to give me a massive handout, I think it would be very hard for the council to say, no thanks. If I've got a whole bunch of projects that I want to fund, I'm going to raise my rates instead. so I think for the councils, I think they're just being quite open about the fact that they want some money.
A little bit like the money that they ladle out to the press and the media for payment. So they do say what they want them to say, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's true. It was the $55 million fund for the journalists. I think really the whole issue when it comes to whether it's the journalists or the councils or any other handout, we have become a society where people just want to dish out money. And the government seems to think that they can dish out money and get away with it. And that's really why ACT exists in opposition to question where the money's going and what the actual outcomes are going to be. And another area is mental health. You know, they're now spending $1.9 billion every year on mental health, and yet the mental health providers and the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commissions say we don't see the improvements in care that you would expect to see with more money being spent. You know, I think we need to get back to basics and actually have better regulatory responsibility, and especially when we're spending money, because that money ultimately comes from you. You know, we are taking in money every year from people and expecting services. But there's a lot of money that's just been sloshing around, and the government's getting used to being able to borrow and spend and get away with it. And I say no more.
That sort of illustrates what I feel, that we spend, we throw money at things, but nothing happens. We don't do anything, we throw money at it. I used to work for a Japanese company, and they used to tell us what we had to do, but they said, well, there's no more money, you do it within the money that you're getting. And you'd get your head down and you'd actually do something. But we're not doing anything, or nothing's being done in the country, we're just throwing money at it.
That's true. And one area that I'm very proud of as the ACT Party is we've put forward an idea which is called the Regulatory Responsibility Bill. And this is an idea that really is quite basic. And it's when the government passes any new law, it should just sit down and diagnose what the problem really is. Instead of just saying, you know what, we've got a solution, we'll create a new law, everything's hunky-dory, here's a new ban, here's a new regulation. We actually need to define what the problem is, weigh up the costs, weigh up the benefits, ask the question of who gets the costs and who would get the benefits, and actually ask, is there any other way that this problem could be addressed other than changing a new law? And I think if you had to write all of those down under the law to say that this is being regulatory responsibility, you'd end up finding that the government would not be passing quite as many laws because you'd actually have to put down in black and white basic principles of what problem are you actually trying to solve. And I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing in society at the moment is that we're misdiagnosing the problem. And if you look, just like I was saying about the mixed density residential standard idea, I think if you actually had proper policy analysts looking at what is the problem you're trying to solve, you wouldn't then say we need three-story homes on every section. You'd then go a step further and say, what's actually holding back the development? And it's the infrastructure that's connecting the cities. I think we need to have better policy. And that's a very simple solution that the ACT Party's put forward under the name of David Seymour. And I'm hoping that other parties would accept it. And I'd be very concerned if they didn't, because it means that they're not 100% sure that their policies work. So.
After the budget, Grant Robertson very proudly announced that 82% or so of New Zealanders were on some sort of a government handout. Does ACT have any policy to try and change some of that welfare into development of business, or as you say, productivity?
Yeah, well, I think one of the really scary things is that he thinks it's a good idea that 80% of New Zealanders will be on a form of benefit. And I think we're slowly getting into this kind of situation where if you're waking up at the budget, you're now starting to question, what is the government giving me? Because it's giving everybody something else. And if you could point to your neighbour and say, oh, that person gets a $350 payout, or that person there gets X, Y, Z. I think this becomes a terrible, terrible state of affairs. We actually need a productive economy where people wake up in the morning and think, how can I work harder and smarter to create more jobs for other people, but also so that I can save and invest in my own future, and I can save and invest in the future of my children, instead of just waiting for the government to fix everything for you. One area that I do want to see changed is foreign direct investment. We make it so hard for anybody to send foreign direct investment into New Zealand. The OECD says that it's easier to send money to Myanmar and China than it is to send it to New Zealand. That's how afraid we are of foreign money. And I think that's wrong. I think we need to change the rules so that we can get more capital investment in New Zealand, because that will lead to more productivity growth, and that will help a lot of smaller companies as well get more capital. That's an easy solution. I think we need to get away from especially the fair pay agreements that are going to be coming this year as well. That's going to really stifle innovation in small companies. And we know that that's a fact from looking at the overseas investment. The FPA agreements will only help a big player, and they won't help a smaller competitor. They'll be stifled out of the market. There are a whole range of things that I'm sure I could come back to you on. But I think, yeah, foreign direct investment is a big one. And also making sure that we're changing the culture when it comes to taxation. Our tax policy says, it's a little bit unfair that every time you get a pay bump, you're more closer to getting a tiny bit extra taken off your pay. And we say it just needs to be fairer. So we have a 2-tier tax system where you have a 17.5% tax rate until $70,000. Anything over $70,000 is at 28%, or matching the business tax rate. Because, it seems weird to say to younger people, work harder and harder and you'll be able to get ahead. But at the same time, the government says to people, if you work harder and harder, we want to take a little bit more from you each time. So we think it should be fairer. 2 tax rates makes it simple, makes it less bureaucratic, and I think goes a little bit of the way towards making sure that younger people actually want to work hard and stay here.